All right, everybody. So we've already gone through all the cards at this point. So I just thought I'd take a little time right now and kind of go through the collection of them, the numbered ones, as they sort of relate to one another. Because I think this is an important part of the tarot in general, and this particular deck shares that same thing. So when we talk about the numbers in tarot, very often, from a metaphysical point of view, very often we're talking about the Kabbalah, because the numbers 1 through 10 relate to the Sephira on the Tree of Life and so forth. But the concept of numerical mysticism and numerical metaphysics, as far as we know, kind of predates Kabbalah, although it could be argued that they were created contemporaneously. But Pythagoras had a number of mysticism, and really all over the ancient world, there were mystical ideas about the various numbers. And in the book that many of you are going to be receiving along with your tarot deck, at the beginning of each chapter on the numbered cards, or it's not really a chapter, little section of the numbered cards, I include an extended quotation from a book called Numbers by W.W. Westcott, who was one of the founders of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. But at that time period, right when they were starting their organization, they actually published a lot of esoteric stuff, what they could get their hands on in good translation or translate themselves easily. They published a significant amount of it. And I think it was probably somewhat of a recruitment tool, both for the Golden Dawn, and also for the SRIA, the Rosicrucian organization that was somewhat associated with Freemasonry, that they were all a part of as well. So those sorts, there's 9 of them plus 1 or 2 others that aren't officially part of the collection, but there are these various mystical things that Westcott and a couple of other people from the Golden Dawn published in the right around the time period that the Golden Dawn was founded. And I only mention all that just because while the books are interesting in and of themselves, they don't relate to the Golden Dawn specifically. So this numbers book, what essentially it is he has a few sections on various different forms of number mysticism, but then he just goes through the numbers one through, I think it's 12, and shares quotes from various ancient authors. There's one in particular, I think his name is Pausanias, who ends up getting quoted quite a bit. But and the ancient authors themselves are often quoting other authors in it. So there's it's a system of thought that has been collected for thousands of years, and Westcott kind of consolidates it all into one place, and so you'll get to see some different ideas. My thoughts about the numbers in tarot, are influenced by Kabbalah, although in creating this deck, I intentionally tried not to really reference Kabbalah all that much directly. And in that Kabbalah, I don't really mean the Jewish mystical tradition so much as the 19th century and somewhat earlier than that too, European version of it that really was more a way of kind of putting together all the Hermetic and Rosicrucian and ancient doctrines into sort of a bunch of convenient file cases, which is where all those tables that people like so much, where we compare which god goes in what space, that all comes from that sort of idea of utilizing the Kabbalistic tree of life as a sort of a diagram to model everything. And it's kind of become a little bit of a tool that people use. I mean, you see everyone from sort of transpersonal psychologists using it to obviously occultists. And then I even saw a guy who wrote a book on Buddhism, practical meditative Buddhism, and he throws the tree of life in there as a way of looking at it. So it's a model that isn't really that connected with the Bible anymore, and really never was. But that really has nothing to do with these cards per se. So let me just run through them and show you how they're kind of related to one another. Okay, so and that's my real point tonight. Oops, that's just one. So these are the aces, all the aces together, and I think I've shown this group a couple other times. But you can see they're all related to one another, and they probably bear a closer relationship with the court cards than they do with any of the other cards. But so each one of these is in its way kind of an iconic image from the Greek magical papyri, if you can say that, since it's an obscure thing to begin with. But you know, if you've been obsessed with the Greek magical papyri as much as I have, all of these things are somehow important to you, most likely. So this is obviously, that's the round phylactery with the lion serpent in it, and this is the sword of Dardanos, which isn't really represented this way anywhere, but the principle of the sword of Dardanos is significant, both because it's an interesting spell, but also because it's one of the few that there actually is a gem from antiquity that basically is exactly the gem that would have been used for this spell. And that's one of the few cases where we have like there's a couple others, but it's one of the main ones where you can say like, this is a sign that someone is really doing this magic, and here's a piece of history of that. And then obviously this one I've mentioned before. This is the Invocation of Apollo. And this is quite an iconic one because it's got these symbols on the leaves, and it's just a very interesting kind of approach to that subject. And then this is the vision of Aphrodite, the vessel divination of Aphrodite, which is one of the, it's a fairly simple and yet very pretty kind of an operation. So those are the aces, and again, I chose those to represent sort of like archetypal, energies of these things within the PGM, how they play out within the PGM. The symbol itself of the the ace, as I've said over and over again, kind of the fountainhead, the beginning, the start of things, the unitary state of things. And in one way or another, those all represent that idea. It's a bit of a difficult idea to represent, because ultimately, if one is all there is, then there is nothing. There's no differentiation between anything. So every kind of pictorial representation is going to be a cheat a little bit, just because it's impossible to really do otherwise. And the twos I've gone over a little bit more than some of the other ones, but I'll just quickly mention again. So two is a very simple concept. It's about things that are either connected or disconnected from one another. So I represent that in 4 different ways on the 4 cards. I won't exhaust that concept anymore, but you can see they're all different ways of looking at that concept. As we get to 3, we have really the first time that we see imbalance happen, and yet it's actually a concept that kind of represents things coming into being for the first time, because 2 can't. It's really impossible for there to be just 2 things. There has to be the 2 things and then whatever's between them. That you can't really have 2 isolated. It's if you think about it, it's an impossibility. And so the two and the 1, the ace, the monad, are more theoretical. But once we get to the 3s, we have an actual situation. There's beginning, middle, and end. There's 2 things and the space in which they occupy. There's the father, the mother, and the child. So all of a sudden we have a bunch of concepts coming into being, all of which sort of have to do with manifestation and moving forward in one's life. So the cards here represent sort of, again, 4 different ways of thinking about those. Oops, I've got a 4 in there by accident. 4 different ways of thinking about these 3 things. We can have, there's 2 people, or two concepts colliding with one concept to dominate it, and then we can have one concept sort of superseding or synthesizing 2 different opposing concepts. Those are 2 ways of looking at it. And then there's 2 things coming together into a third thing. And that's very much the sort of cycle of life kind of way of thinking about things. And then we have one person or one idea sort of instructing the other two ideas. So that's where the number 3 comes in. And if anyone has any questions about anything that I'm saying or wants to argue with me or anything like that, feel free to say something in the chat and I will be happy to answer at the end. So 4 for me is a number that represents stability. We have the the square shape, which represents sort of like structural soundness. We also have the first solid, the tetrahedron, which is of course a very simple and yet very structurally sound object. But there's a sense of incompleteness in it as well. So it's a space where things are coming together and yet there's clearly room for more. So the cards represent, again, various forms of this concept. Within the wands, which have to do with dynamic energies, we have them all sort of going together, aligned with one another, but not necessarily forever, at least for the time being. I've talked about each of these individually, but so like I just want to show them kind of how they are related and unrelated to one another. And as we get to 5, 5 has, in the ancient world, it was considered to be a very good number. It was a number of marriage, it was a number of sort of productivity and things. The ancient philosophers had the tendency to like the odd numbers more than the even numbers. For the reason, I believe, I'm not mixing this up too much, for the reason that the even numbers could be split in half into 2 separate things, and so were inherently unstable, leaning towards uncertainty and unclarity, whereas the odd numbers, because of the fact that they were unable to be divided evenly, would always create relationship moving forward. I don't know if I'm saying that in a way that you guys can understand. I should mention I'm a little bit under the weather tonight. So here's so the 5s in the tarot are all basically, through in our modern usage of it, both with the Golden Dawn system and the Rider-Smith Waite deck. They're all pretty bad. They don't have a positive energy. And yet I've always felt like, and that's in part because they're associated with Mars and in Kabbalah with Geburah, which is judgment and justice and sort of that, meting out the punishments of the divine. And I've always felt like numerically there's some good in 5 that is unutilized. Now my cards all do depict things in somewhat of a chaotic state, because I didn't want to, like I've mentioned before, I didn't really want to undo the tarot. But those of you who are tuning into this, I want you to understand that I don't think that 5 is a necessarily inherently troublesome number, and the ancients didn't feel that way either. So some of the ways in which you can think of 5 as being more on the positive side, the pentagram shape contains the phi ratio, the golden mean. I don't have a pentagram depicted on any of these, but the part of a pentagram is basically made up of 5 triangles, and the part of the triangle that is at the bottom of the longer part of each of the triangles, the part that makes a hexagram in the middle of it, that, or hexagon, I mean, that is one part of phi, and then the side that goes outward is the other part of phi. Those two have that 1.6 to 1 ratio that is the golden mean, and that ratio has first of all, it's one that's very aesthetically pleasing to human beings. But it also contains a bunch of sort of mathematical properties that create the spiral shape in shells and create the actually the the reproductive rate of you know, of a closed system of animals. And they also, it also, if you look at a plant, most plants will actually grow in a almost exact pentagram shape, because that's the most efficient way of capturing the light of the sun. So there's a lot of things about growth and expansion and moving forward that, you know, and doing things in the most sort of harmonious way to create and grow, are contained within that concept of 5 through its geometrical pattern. So I mean, if you're doing a reading with these cards and it seems like the 5 is out of place in the setting of whatever, you know, everything else is extremely positive, but then this 5 is there in a place that doesn't seem like it quite fits, consider that alternate perspective, that it is a strong, intense energy, but not necessarily one that is inherently destructive. And, you know, because obviously none of the numbers are inherently destructive, because if we had a destructive number running through the whole thing, it would mess it all up. It's more our relationship with those forces that that create issues. So in the cards, we see various ways in which the 5 can kind of create problems. And in you know, in both of the swords cards, it's kind of, I mean, so both of the long cards, the swords and the wands, it's kind of like a disagreement. And then in the water card, the cup card, it's both a mess being made and a disagreement. And then in the Pentacles one, it's represented with sort of like people not getting what they want. They're searching for things and feeling like they're not getting what they need. And I think I've already talked about the reasons for those in the previous videos. So then 6, again, considered a very positive number in the ancient world, despite being you know, an even number. It you know, it's sort of the mean number between 1 and 10, and its geometric shape again kind of says a lot about it. You know, the hexagram is of course a symbol that has been used the world over as a you know, a powerful symbol, as has the pentagram for that matter, the 5 symbol. But the hexagram in particular, it points to the fact that there's, you know, if you make circles around the points of the hexagram and then one in the center, they're all the same size and they all fit perfectly, which is believed to be the reason why bees make their combs that way, because they can pack the absolute most amount into place. And it's also a shape that is incredibly structurally sound. So we see it in a lot of like industrial applications as being a, you know, a shape that kind of holds its form very well with a very small amount of material. So you know, in terms of both 5 and 6, if you read, when you read this, the quotes in the book that I mentioned before, they're associated with marriage. And so, you know, they have with the 5, it's because 2 is often associated with female, and 3 is associated with the male, I believe. Again, sorry, my head's a little foggy today. And with the 6, obviously, it's because we see that interchange between the 2 triangles. You know, if you look at a hexagram, it is 2 equilateral triangles that are juxtaposed with each other. So, you know, this idea of connection and interpenetration is strong in that, as well as the structurally soundness of it. So, you know, in these cards, the only one that is not symmetrical in it is the wands, and that's just simply because they're kind of moving forward in it, but they're moving forward together, and it shows them sort of in a happy, triumphant state. But the rest of them are all represented by sort of symmetrical shapes, all of which in one way or another, with the possible exception of the swords, although it's not clear whether they're fighting or if they're just sort of doing an exercise together. But the rest of them are sort of celebratory and represented by a symmetrical shape. The sevens are in the tarot. The sevens are, excuse me, I go like, the sevens are somewhat similar to the fives in that they all have kind of a less positive energy to them, but with the sevens, it's a little bit more ambiguous, and it's clearly ambiguous in the way that people represent it artistically, but also just in the the functions that are assigned to it generally in a reading. Although some people's reading styles will differ from this, but generally it represents things that are in a state of sort of unsure if they're going to come together in the way that we want them to. We see this in the Pentacles with their sort of waiting for their coins to finish growing. It becomes sort of an agricultural thing in this card. And again, there's an egg there representing that sort of hope and possibility for the future, but without necessarily things are going to work out the way that you want to. In the wands, again, we see sort of a contention happening, although the intent of this card is that the single character is sort of winning out over the rest of them, whereas in the swords, it looks like the rest of them are sort of winning out over the one that's on the ground. But again, we're not sure how the conclusion is going to go, and the rest of what's going on in the reading would affect what that would come out as. And the Seven of Cups, it represents some people sort of having a lot of fun, which can work out well, or it can work out poorly, depending on how things go. The eights, they again have a largely, they're not really symmetrical, but they're systematized, because eight is it's a doubling of 4, which, as I said, was sort of a stable place within the numbers, and so 8 just sort of repeats that pattern of stability, but with a little bit more going on in it. So we see everyone sort of working in harmony with the coins. We see the soldiers all marching in formation, and we see the wand-bearing philosophers of the wand suit. They are all running in formation very swiftly, and then the one outlier is the cups in this case, and what's happening here is that the rest of the folks are sort of speaking with one another, and the one lone person wandering off is feeling like there's something that needs to be explored, but they're not quite sure how to manage that exploration, and that has to do with sort of the divinatory meaning that I usually have for that card. So the number 9 represents, first and foremost in my mind, kind of horizon. It represents sort of the near to things coming to fruition. Things are moving in the way of of manifesting the way that you want, but you aren't necessarily quite there yet. And that obviously comes from its position within the numbers. It's next from last. It also has the quality of being 3 threes, and so it has some of that energy of sort of cycles and connections between things. So in this deck, we see things kind of in the midst of happening, or nearly happening, but they're not quite at their stopping point. And you'll see what I mean when we look at the 10s, because they're much more at their stopping point. But so we have again the wands people aren't necessarily fighting, but they're putting pressure on the one in the center, but he is holding his own because he's clear on what his path is. With the cups, she's sort of presiding over her territory, and you know, making things happen for herself, although not necessarily quite there. And so the Pentacles, this is sort of, again, a sort of a harvest theme that comes up in the Pentacles, and they are sort of taking their harvest to town or to back to their homes or whatever. They're sort of in the process of you know, having that gainful experience. And then the swords, the one with the one who's sort of the odd man out is really in trouble at this point. And then in the tens, which represent, you know, the end of the cycle, or the preparation for the renewal of the cycle, but really things coming together, the world as it is, we see sort of the final result of these things. So with the wands, we see that the final result is that everyone is sort of like given over their wands to the philosopher who's been contending the whole time, and now he has to bear the burden of it all. The swords, as is typical of the swords, represent sort of the destruction of the guy. And then with the cups, we see sort of a final celebration taking place, similar to the six, but even more extensive. It's the art is pretty similar for the two of them intentionally, because both represent sort of like everything coming together in a balanced way that makes everyone feel, you know, connected with one another and joyous, and that everything is coming together the way that they want. And with the final one, we see that stack of coins in the middle there is the Tetractys of Pythagoreans, and they're all sort of like reverencing it, and that's, I guess, an allusion to the Pythagorean number mysteries that are sort of in there throughout casually. So that's sort of my presentation on this. If you guys have any questions, it's fine. Or if you just are tired like me and you just want to go to bed, I appreciate that you sat through yet another one of these things, and it's always nice to see you. And I'm gonna go ahead and send you all upon your merry way, and we'll do one or two more of these talking about some other various aspects of the relationships between these cards. And until then, good night.